Hello and welcome to my presentation about speaking and the brain. In this presentation, I'm going to explain why speaking to an audience is one of the most efficient ways to learn a foreign language. If you're a language teacher in Europe, you've certainly noticed that speaking has become a lot more important in recent years. This is mainly due to the CEF, the Common European Framework, and the speaking exams that are based on it. If you ask me, that is good news, because speaking practice will not only help your learners do well in these standardized exams, speaking practice will also improve your learners' fluency, expand their vocabulary, and help them learn new grammar concepts and structures. Stay tuned to find out why speaking is such an efficient method and how to organize speaking practice even if you're teaching large groups and cannot afford to spend endless class time on presentations. Let's start with a few well-known facts. Unfortunately, knowledge and skills cannot be transferred from the teacher's brain into the learner's brains. Learning is an active process. It's the learners who must be doing most of the work. You have certainly seen similar diagrams about memory retention rates. Both researchers and practitioners agree that listening to a lecture, that's the top of the pyramid, is the least efficient way of learning. People remember very little, only about 5% when they only listen to a lecture. Reading the same content is a little better already. Readers remember about 10% approximately after one reading. Reading involves more active processing, and readers can vary the speed of their reading and go at their own pace. But let's be honest, 10% is still not a lot. By combining the two and adding visuals to a presentations or a lecture, people remember a lot more. Two input channels are involved simultaneously, and this leads to activity in several parts of the brain and therefore more learning. As we go down the pyramid, we see that more and more activity is involved. Demonstrations usually involve step-by-step visual instructions accompanied by spoken commentary. Discussion groups involve the learners even more actively, as they have to test their understanding and compare and contrast it with the understanding and views of others. Practicing something by doing it, or in case of language learning, producing language actively, also involves a lot of brain activity and depth of processing. And last but not least, teaching and explaining the new ideas and concepts to others, to peers for example, requires critical understanding and evaluation and clear structuring of the subject matter. This involves lots of connections and lots of activity across different areas of the brain. To cut the long story short, we can say that the more actively we're involved, the more we learn. How does learning actually work? Let's look inside the brain more closely. In recent years, the neurosciences have provided us with very helpful and interesting explanations. We can say that learning is a physical-chemical process. In a nutshell, learning means that neurons that fire together wire together. That is, neurons that are active simultaneously build neural networks. This is probably the most important single information that you need to remember here. Neurons that fire together wire together. These active networks will get stronger and faster the more they are used. This process is called myelinization. Imagine these strong networks as rail tracks or highways in the brain. They're fast, they're reliable, and they run on autopilot, so we can use our working memory to juggle different things. The second thing you need to understand is that learning only works if our emotional brain decides to let the new information in so that we can engage actively with the new matter. We'll be looking at this key role of the emotional brain a little later. In order to maximize learning, we want to create situations where our learners actively use as many areas of the brain as possible, and thus create and expand and strengthen their neural networks. Even these very basic bits of information show that speaking is actually a very efficient method of learning. It is active, it involves large parts of the brain, and thus creates large neural networks that will fire and wire together. What happens when we speak, and why is speaking so efficient? In addition to other processes involved in language production, like recalling items from memory, making connections, planning and assembling language in the Broca area, speaking requires the use and control of a large number of muscles in the face, the tongue, the mouth, and often the hands, as well as hearing our own words and message. Speaking thus activates more different areas of our brains than any, or at least than most other language-related activity. In the picture on the right, you can see all the yellow, green, and red areas of the brain. They're all actively firing and wiring while someone is speaking. Let's zoom in a bit more and see what is happening inside and how these neural networks can guide our thinking and perception. To understand this better, we'll do a little experiment. I invite you to think of a famous physicist. Can you come up with a person's name? And maybe recall an image of this person's face? Is this the same person you have come up with? Who is it? Most people see Albert Einstein in this picture. He is the one great physicist that we all know. Now, have a look at the picture of Venus by Botticelli. Look at it for a little while and explore the details. What do you see now? Is this the same picture? Do you see anything new in it? What has happened here? Your neural network of a famous physicist contains the name and image of Albert Einstein. By triggering this network, your perception was focused on Einstein's face, and most of you did not notice the pool and the ladies taking a bath. Most of you probably saw Einstein's nose and cheeks instead, because this fits into the neural network of a famous physicist. It's only after looking at the picture of Venus that most of you also notice the ladies taking a bath. This is just a tiny example of how our pre-existing knowledge and our expectations guide our perception. We see what we want to see, or rather, what our neural networks allow us to see. Why do we need to know this, and how can this help? Learning means adding new information or new connections to existing networks. By first calling up existing knowledge, we can help our learners add new bits at the right place. For this reason, we want to always start a new topic by giving a general overview and then adding new details. Good old advanced organizers or pre-reading or pre-listening activities do exactly this. The well-known KWL grid used in most American classrooms does exactly this. K here stands for what I know already. Learners activate their prior knowledge. They search their neural networks for information about the topic. These networks will then be actively guiding what comes next. W stands for what I want to find out. Learners search their brains for possible questions, possible connections, and missing links that will guide their perception during the lesson. And L stands for what I have learned and requires the learners to actively recap and reflect on their newly acquired knowledge or skills. This will activate the same networks again and thus strengthen them through meaningful repetition and use. The magic of neurons that fire together, wire together, is actually quite simple, but it is so powerful for learning. Let's try this out. Let's apply this new idea in a classroom setting and ask ourselves, why do we not remember word lists or vocabulary lists, as well as vocabulary learned in real-life contexts or multi-sensory contexts? Can you explain this phenomenon? Why do we not remember word lists as well as vocabulary learned in real-life contexts? Obviously, our neural networks play an important role here. When we learn new vocabulary as single words without any context, in the back of a lesson as a list, as it is the case here, for example, with these two vocab words, the words used to and hilarious, without any context here, we cannot tie them to our existing networks easily. Such new words will have very few connections or links and can therefore not be retrieved easily. Imagine them as disorganized, floating vocab cards. How will you find the one you need? Let's look at the two vocab words again, used to and hilarious. My daughter Anna used to play with her doll Fritzy for hours on end. She used to feed him carrots and to share all her foods with him. We used to go camping in Greece. And the word hilarious reminds me of the hilarious jokes that the Snagglegrollop used to tell. If we can tag new words to existing networks in our brains, we can remember and use them more easily. Our prior networks will add depth and meaning, colorful connotations, images and experiences to the new words, and thus make them part of a wide network in our brain. We will find them whenever we activate the respective network. Single words, on the other hand, will be like needles in a haystack. They may be in there somewhere, but how can we find them? Where do they belong? How do we use them? So let's keep in mind, we always want to tie new information to existing networks. Let's zoom in even further. What we can see here is a basic explanation of signal transmission in neural networks. The schematic drawing on the left shows how chemical and electric signals are passed on from one synaptic ending to another across the synaptic cleft. Neurons consist of a cell body. Information always comes in through the dendrites, the little branches on the left, and is passed on through the axons. In our example, the axon has a strong myelin sheath marked in yellow. This protein insulation allows the signal to jump from one node to the next and thus makes signal transmission faster and more reliable. The signal then exits through the axon terminal and is passed on to the dendrites of a neighboring cell. We won't go into detail here, this is for biologists and neuroscientists, but we need to understand that this process can be influenced from outside. Teaching is the art of changing the brain. Let's look at this in more detail. One of the most interesting and helpful books on learning and the brain is James Zoll's The Art of Changing the Brain. He tells us that learning is biology, not psychology. And teachers can actually influence this down to the cellular, the chemical level of signal transmission between synapses. It's a fascinating book, very readable for teachers. We want to take a brief look at what teachers can do to help or hinder learning. What kind of tasks and methods are most efficient so learning takes place right in our classroom, right in our lesson? The first thing we need to do is to find the key to the learner's brains. Body, mind, and soul are interconnected. We need to know that emotions are the key to the brain. Depending on the kind of input we receive, our limbic system, that is the emotional center of our brain, will lock up or open the door to higher order processing. Let's look at this door opening function in more detail. The importance of our learners' emotional mechanisms is often underestimated. Actually, emotional and social aspects of learning are at least as important as the intellectual and cognitive ones. Children decide quickly and unconsciously whether to turn their brains on or whether to stay in standby mode. Within seconds, their brain's emotional center, that is the limbic system, will decide whether the teacher's words, voice, and body language match and are therefore authentic and reliable, whether the topic is relevant and interesting, and whether the situation in the classroom is relaxed or threatening. Let's follow the brain along the typical steps from input to learning. A stimulus, in this case, let's assume it's sound waves. The teacher's voice, for example, enters the brain and reaches the thalamus. The thalamus is an important part of our limbic system, our emotional center. Here we have two options. The thalamus filters incoming information, and if the incoming signal is marked as irrelevant, it will be discarded. In our picture, it goes into the bin. This is an important filter. We do not want to worry about all kinds of background noise, cars passing by, and other irrelevant signals in our environment. If the stimulus is perceived as important, or at least potentially important, the thalamus will let it through and pass it on to the amygdala. In our picture, we see two of these yellow almond-shaped objects. Here, incoming signals are checked for their emotional content. Is the incoming stimulus associated with danger, or does it seem harmless? Some of these danger signals are innate, we're born with them. Humans and many animals are afraid of fire, even if we have not yet been burned. Other dangers need to be learned and acquired in the course of our lives. Whenever an incoming stimulus is marked as dangerous, the amygdala sends signals to the hypothalamus and the brainstem, and our body prepares for flight or fight. adrenaline and other neurotransmitters are released, our blood pressure and pulse frequency rise, our muscle tonus rises, and our body prepares for fight or for flight reflexes. In this case, any kinds of higher order thinking are turned off. This cycle could save lives in the wild, but does it help in exams? I like to call this the triple A reaction, the amygdala, adrenaline, anxiety. It produces a cognitive style that facilitates basic automatic routines, but prevents free associations and any kinds of higher order thinking. Let's go back to the incoming signal and assume that the amygdala has decided it's harmless. Only then is the stimulus passed on to the hippocampus and the cortex. And only then will any higher order processing take place in the cortex. What does this mean? Fear and anxiety prevent learning. We must create a relaxed, safe atmosphere to open our learners' brains. This is really important for speaking activities. Here, danger may not only come from a teacher who penalizes every little mistake. Danger might also come from classmates who laugh at you or find fault at your presentation. In all these cases, no or hardly any learning will happen. Let's sum this up again. Higher order processing and learning will happen if and only if the incoming message is not associated with danger and if it is perceived as important, relevant, and meaningful. Have a look at the green picture on the right. What we see here is the physical proof of learning. These little knobs on the dendrites are called spines. They are nerve endings that can receive input and help transmit electrical signals to the neuron's cell body. These spines will grow better if they are fed or fertilized, as we can say, by a neurotransmitter called acetylcholine. Acetylcholine is released in the limbic system if the incoming stimulus is perceived as important and relevant. In this case, the transmitter will trigger chemical changes that increase the responsiveness of existing synapses. It makes them stronger and produces new ones. What this really means for teachers is that highly efficient learning is taking place, and it is triggered by the learner's emotional systems. Acetylcholine also works in the brains of rats. They can learn new tricks more quickly when they are associated with food or other rewards. In this case, the stimulus is perceived as important. Acetylcholine is released and learning happens more easily and more efficiently. How can we use this to teach grammar? Isn't grammar always boring? Let's take a quick look at an example. How do you normally teach the passive voice? Do you ask your learners to transform active sentences into passive ones, as we see in this table? Is this meaningful? Can such sentences ever trigger an importance signal? Can such sentences trigger acetylcholine? Why not try a different approach? Have you ever asked yourself how ketchup is made? Or do you know how chocolate is made? Or how iPhones are made? Why don't you ask your students to find out how some of their favorite things are made by watching some YouTube clips that explain these production processes? Why not make them curious and thus turn their importance signals on, flood their brains with acetylcholine and other helpful neurotransmitters, while exposing them to the new passive forms in interesting and meaningful contexts? After this kind of input, ask them to explain the main steps of these production processes. In this setting, they will use passives naturally. They will use their brains in authentic ways to express meanings rather than forms. They will engage with the topic, and acetylcholine will be released, and learning will happen right there in the classroom. Apart from the key role of the emotional brain, we must be aware of the importance of activating large networks across the learner's brains. Remember, we said neurons that fire together wire together. Here we can see the areas that are active when subjects hear words, see words, speak, and think about words. A brain that does all these things simultaneously will be active in all these areas. We cannot speak without hearing what we say. We cannot speak without moving our lips and tongue. We cannot speak meaningfully without thinking about words and making connections in our frontal brain. For all these reasons, speaking is one of the most efficient ways of learning a language, because our whole brains are involved and neurons all over the brain are firing and wiring while we speak. If we want to activate even more parts of the brain, we can add more movement, more than just moving our lips and mouth. Manuela Macedonia's studies on the role of movement in language learning show how added gestures can improve retention rates dramatically. Manuela Macedonia uses VMIs, that is, voice movement icons, gestures, to teach new vocabulary. Her studies show that gestures, even meaningless ones, strongly enhance learning. Look at the dotted line that shows learning without any gestures. It's the lowest one, the gray one. The blue curve above shows a huge increase, even though the gestures were random and totally meaningless. The yellow line shows the retention rate for words that were learned in combination with iconic gestures, that is, gestures that support the meanings of the words. Let's sum up what we've learned so far. Before I finish, I'd like to invite you to look at my summary images here. Do these pictures ring any bells now? It's your turn. Pause this video at this point and try to sum up the meaning of each icon before listening to my summary. This will activate your networks and you will remember the facts better. So, what do the icons stand for? We understand that learning is an active process. Information cannot be transferred from the teacher's brain into the learner's brains. We also know that learning is physical. It is a physical chemical process of building and adding to existing neural networks. We also know that we can influence this process. Remember, James Zoll says that teaching is the art of changing the brain, of creating conditions that lead to a change in the learner's brains. We understand that learning involves the whole person, body, mind, and soul. We want to avoid stress and anxiety because they lead to a fight or flight reaction where higher order processing does not work. We can turn the brain on by creating a relaxed learning environment and offer input that is new, interesting, and relevant for the learners. This will trigger a chemical importance signal, acetylcholine, which serves as a kind of fertilizer for the growth of new dendrite spines. More spines and more connections mean more learning. And last but not least, we want to make sure our learners use as many parts of their brains as possible. We know that neurons that fire together wire together. The more parts of our brains are active simultaneously, the better these networks, the bigger these networks. Meaningful, engaging speaking activities performed in a relaxed atmosphere will do all that. Now it's time for a break. If you would like to find out how to put these ideas into practice and how to create meaningful speaking activities, watch the second part of my video after the break.